Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Ships, Sea and the Stars from Royal Museums Greenwich. Every week we're bringing you fantastic stories of the sea, space, history and creativity, all with the help of the museum's curators, who are an extremely knowledgeable lot, and also special expert guests. And we've got two fabulous guests with us today. If there's a question about the topics that you'd like answered, or if there's a topic you think we really should cover that you'd love to hear about, do please get in touch. We would love to hear from you. And the way to do that is to look for Royal Museums Greenwich on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter. So on to the real show here. And today's topic is Hidden Greenwich. Greenwich is an area just outside central London. It's famous worldwide for lots of things, for its maritime history, for its ports, the observatory on the hill that gave its name to Greenwich Mean Time, and for the royal palaces that were built there. And there's lots of this type of history. There's empires and kings and queens and famous people and rich people. And the thing is that they were not the only citizens of Greenwich. And today what we're going to talk about is some of the hidden histories, the stories that don't get told, that are actually right there if you know where to look. And to help us explore all of this, we have a curator from the museum, a historian, and someone who has spent quite a lot of time literally digging into Thames history. So let me introduce to you Louise Devoy, who is the senior curator of the Royal Observatory, S.I. Martin, who's an author and historian, and Laura Maitland, an author and mudlarker. So let's hear a little bit from each of you about your connection with this topic. Let's start with Louise.
Hi Helen. Well, I'm really interested in trying to sort of unlock the secret histories of the observatory, thinking about not just all the fancy telescopes and the precision clocks, but really digging in to think about the people who lived and worked there and for whom it really was a very special place.
And Steve, how about you?
Well, my connection with Greenwich is multiple. I mean, I'm a writer, researcher in Black histories, patterns of settlement, and I'm obsessed with stories connected to the Royal Navy, maritime culture, the presence of Black sailors, Black mariners, and their settlement, and as I call it, the armpits of the Thames, Deptford, Greenwich. And I also have to add, yes, I was also previously an employee of the Maritime Museum, Archive Learning.
Well, they employ all the best people. So that's not a surprise. And Laura, how about you? What's your connection to this topic?
Hi, Helen. Greenwich is a really special place for me. Until a few years ago, I was a long-term resident of Greenwich. So I've lived very close to the river for a very, very long time. And I have whiled away hours and hours and hours staring into the mud in front of the museum and the Naval College by the river. I'm a mudlark, so I'm looking for evidence of all those people who lived in Greenwich, all the ordinary people and all the people whose lives played out in Greenwich and along the river.
Fabulous. Well, let's start with a very traditional view of Greenwich. This was written by a guy called Charles Heath in his Views of London, and it was written in 1825, and this was what he thought Greenwich was all about.
It is difficult to find a view more generally attractive than that of the Thames and the metropolis from Greenwich Hill. The sylvan beauty immediately surrounding the spectator in the park finely contrasts with the great emporium of the trade and commerce of the world, and the home of every refined art and ennobling science discernible in the vapoury distance. As the eye bends towards the foreground, the bosom of the Thames expands and becomes animated with glittering ships, while the appearance of an occasional vessel of war points out the dockyard at Deptford and insensibly awakens the patriotic recollections connected with the still nearer magnificence of Greenwich Hospital and College.
Well, he's certainly enthusiastic about it. So let's get your reactions to that. I mean, my general reaction is that he's impressed by the grandeur. But how about each of you? What's there and what was not there? What struck you in all of that? Steve, perhaps let's start with you.
Okay, I mean, what really strikes me is that, well, firstly, he's not entirely wrong in what strikes the eye even today in contemporary Greenwich, but he doesn't point to anything that underpins its presence, particularly its maritime histories and cultures. And, you know, for my interests, there is no mention of other populations, people from other parts of the world who were already settling in and around Greenwich by that time for a host of reasons.
Laura, how about you? What do you pull out of that or think isn't there?
Well, he's obviously bringing out all the fabulous buildings and all the lovely stuff that's there. What he's missing is the ordinary people who are living there, the tumble down taverns along the river, the fishing fleet, the fishermen that used to be stationed at Greenwich, and all this, just the old buildings, and really the poverty in Greenwich. There was a great deal of poverty there and ordinary people that lived there. And he's focusing in on really the grandeur of Greenwich.
And Louise, how about you?
Yes, similar to Lara. So we have this very grand, quite relaxed and sort of recreational sense of Greenwich as this place where you can wander in the park. But for me, I think behind those walls at the observatory, you've got this more sort of beehive of activity, of people doing endless hours of observations and calculations where life was tough. So quite a contrast to that very genteel image outside.
Well, let's get straight into some of the everyday things in there. So Lara, we're going to come to you, and the first object you've got to show us has a great name to start with. It's a fairy pipe. Tell us about this.
I do. Well, my first object, I'll hold it up first. Hopefully you can see it. If I put my hand behind it, that might make it better.
Yes.
So as you can see, this is a tiny, tiny, tiny little clay pipe. And this dates back to around 1580. So it's the very earliest type of clay pipe that you can find. Now, I find clay pipes all along the river. They're one of the most ordinary things you can find because everybody smoked. And they weren't throwaway. Our ancestors weren't as wanton as that. They would use them until they broke too short and they became nose warmers. You know, they were just too smoke, you know, you got a burnt nose when you were smoking them. And these tiny, tiny ones date back to the time when there was a medieval palace at Greenwich. Some of the footings and some of the foundations are still beneath what Wren built on top of it, which is what we see today. Now, this palace began life as an early medieval manor house. It was taken on by Henry VII. He built a lot onto it, and it was Henry VIII that really took the palace over and built it up into this fantastic, beautiful place by the river. At the time that the tobacco started to come into London around 1580, Elizabeth I was on the throne, and it's said that she actually tried tobacco, and she would have tried it out of a little pipe this small. Perhaps it was bought from the New World by Walter Raleigh, whose ship, she knighted him at Deptford on his ship, the Golden Hind. I find these all over. I'll hold up a later one for you to give you an idea of the size. So this one's around mid-1700s, and you can see how much larger it's got because tobacco was very expensive. There wasn't much of it. As it became more and more popular, the demand grew. More was grown in the New World. More was imported into London and into the UK, into England, and it got cheaper. And so people could afford to smoke more. And so the bowls grew much larger. So that's how you date them. Greenwich is the only place that I found these tiny fairy pipes, and they're called fairy pipes because years and years ago when people found them, they were so small that people thought they were finding pipes that the pixies had smoked. They didn't realize that these were the sort of pipes that people were smoking back then. And it's blackened, it's even blackened inside from the last person who smoked it. It's a really special, precious thing.
How do you, let's just touch on the mudlarking for a moment, because how do you even find, there's two things here. You've got to find things, and then you've got to recognize that that's the interesting bit and not just another piece of clay pipe. How long did it take you? Describe to us a little bit about the process of mudlarking, and how do you acquire the expertise to know which category your object falls in?
Well, as I said, I lived in London, in Greenwich for years and years, right by the river, and I would walk along the foreshore and find things. And really, I've been doing it for over 15 years now. And you learn as you go. You start picking things up and you start researching. You go to Museum of London's a great place to go. Any sort of museum, books online, and you learn about the things that you're picking up and finding, and you just gradually, I just started taking things home and researching them and finding out more and more about them. But the great thing about Greenwich is that the best places to mudlark are the places where there's been history and there's been really condensed human activity. And obviously that part of Greenwich where there would have been the medieval palace, the Tudor palace, there was so much going on there. You can find crockery from the kitchens. You can even find evidence of what they were eating, the bones and the tiny little fish bones and hazelnut shells. If you look carefully, it's incredible what you can find in the mud.
And on the topic, the history that isn't hidden, why is it still there? We think of rivers as things that take things away. How is it? What's special about the places why does it accumulate? Why doesn't it all just, because presumably people threw it in there to make stuff go away quite a lot of the time, and it persistently hung around. Why does it stay?
They did. They did use the river as a massive dump. It was a huge rubbish dump, a very useful one. But they also used rubbish to build up the foreshore. The foreshore was a working environment, and so to make it so that they could stand on it and work on it, and to make it flat, because if you think a river comes in at a V shape, to make it flat, they had to build it up, and they used domestic waste to do that. So they'd build it up behind revetments and pack it down hard. And they'd repair the revetments, they'd repair the foreshore. But from the 60s and 70s, when the ships stopped coming, it was neglected. And so a lot of the revetments, a lot of the foreshore was breaking down. And now with the increased river traffic, it's starting to erode. And the objects that are coming out have been perfectly preserved because the mud is anaerobic. There's no oxygen in there. So you can pull things out like leather shoes, even fabric. You can pull things out that are as perfect as the day they were dropped or lost.
It's just astonishing. I mean, it's a lovely, lovely thing. It's just astonishing. And let's just touch on the idea of empire, because we've mentioned tobacco, and we know that the tobacco trade was a massive, very lucrative trade, and it was the foundation of a lot of, it was a good commodity to bring back. How much of empire do you see on the banks? How much is that history written in there still?
Huge amounts. I mean, I find coins from all over the world. Foreign coins dating back, I've got foreign coins dating back to the 15th century, proving that ships were, coming from far, far away. I've got an 8th century Celtic Irish buckle plate. People were coming from Ireland. People have always come to London. From the Thames is an artery. It brings the rest of the world in, and it sends London out, to colonize the rest of the world. It is how we have sent, Britain, England out to the rest of the world in many cases. I have found trade beads, evidence of sugar refining. Obviously, sugar was brought back from the West Indies. And the pipes are more evidence of all this tobacco that was coming in, great hogsheads of it. And of course, all the wharfs and warehouses would have been stuffed full of spices and tobacco and sugar and rum and all these exotic products from all over the world.
Brilliant. Well, that is a beautiful connector to we're going to talk to Steve now, and because it's easy to forget that global travel isn't new. Everyone thinks global travel is terribly modern, but as you've just said, ships were coming and going, things were coming and going, and people were coming and going. And Steve, you have a picture for us of the old Commodore. Tell us about the old Commodore.
Okay, well, the old Commodore, here he is, the old Commodore, also known as Billy Blue. He was an individual who actually works in one of, for the latter part of his life in these islands, he actually worked in one of the sugar warehouses that Lara was talking about. This warehouse was the Royal Navy's sugar depot, Red House Wharf. But what we know about him is that he was either born in New York or Jamaica. He's listed as either or. It varies depending on the account. He was certainly one of that body of black mariners and black soldiers who ended up in London after the American Revolutionary War, War of Independence. And luckily for him, he found work in Deptford with the Navy Board, as no nice way of saying it, he's running a press gang. Hence, there were about up to 8 press gangs in Deptford. He was running one, and hence his title, the Old Commodore. He leaves that employment and gets work at Red House Wharf, bringing sugar onto from the ship to shore, being a lumper. And he is arrested in 1796 and charged with the theft of 20 pounds in weight of sugar for his night job, which is making chocolate. So he spends about 5 years in hulks in various parts of the Thames. 1801, he ends up going out, being transported as a convict to Australia. And once there, his life really blossoms. He falls in, due to his geniality and his charm, with Governor Macquarie, the governor of a colony, who makes him the harbour watchman of Sydney Harbour. He's also granted the ferry contract across the harbour, and at its height, he's got 11 vessels going back and forth. And in the 1820s, he was granted a parcel of 80 acres of land in North Sydney, which stands to this day, that being Blues Point. It's named after him. There are various institutions still named after him. But his life is just a really interesting introduction for me into the Black peopling of that part of London, Black maritime life, all the various trajectories, which I just find fascinating.
So paint that picture though, because ports are where people mix, right? People come, people go, there's lots of mixing. At that time, how do we know how many Black mariners there were in and around Greenwich? What sorts of communities were they part of?
No, it's hard to come to a solid figure. You can say that there were hundreds dotted about, because I don't want to create the idea that there's one coherent, cohesive community, because you had so many people from diverse origins there for different reasons. For example, in Greenwich in particular, you'd have had ultimately hundreds, going back to the earliest I found 1759, of Black mariners who had been in and out patients of the Seamen's Hospital. Similarly, you had populations of Black servants dotted all around Crooms Hill and Maze Hill, and even more so in Blackheath and going down over into Lee. So we're talking about very, very complex collections of people, as well as people being born here from the 1730s onwards. So it would have been very complex. I don't think it would have been a coherent community apart from the identifier of their skin. But in a way, it prompts more questions than answers.
What was the situation with, was there prejudice against people with darker skin in a way that we would recognise now? Or is it the case that in a port, you know, if you could do the work, you were just another person doing the work? Do we know anything about how they were seen by the...
Yeah, we know quite a lot. I mean, without getting into the... I could bore anyone to tears on the racial politics of the Royal Navy. But because, of course, these islands were at war with France and or Spain throughout the 18th century and early 19th, that need for manpower was just total. And you saw that the Black and Asian labor and manpower was welcome on board naval vessels. It was just, you know, even people who had been running away from enslavement, and there are many and many of those who ended up on His Majesty's vessels, they could find work. So yes, of course, there was racism in the way we'd recognize it. But also, if you look, again, going back to Deptford, 1786, 1787, when there is that attempt to expel the Black poor, over 300 of them, from London, you see that as well as Black men and women going, also the white men and the white women who are married to them are also going, so they're part of the scene. So it's quite complex. And it's not a perfect mirror to our own times, but it certainly prompts reflection.
Well, we're going to move on to some other reflections, and these hidden histories, they're so, it's what I find astonishing about them is that they don't, no one talks about them very much, but as soon as you hear about them, you think, why didn't I think that might be there? And one of those groups is the women in Greenwich. And Louise, you have some examples. You have one you're going to show us, Margaret Maskelyne, who was, you know, a very distinctive figure in Greenwich at the observatory. Tell us a little bit about her.
Yeah, so Margaret Maskelyne was the daughter of Neville Maskelyne, the 5th Astronomer Royal. And we can see this beautiful portrait of her from sort of the 1790s, when she would have been sort of in her mid-teens. And I like the fact that she's just so sort of quietly confident in this. She's quite poised. She's got her home proudly displayed behind her. And it's been really interesting listening to Lara and to Steve, because I can hear sort of parallels with some of her family stories, in that her father, Neville Maskelyne, used to keep really detailed records of everything about daily life at the observatory. So, for example, we know that he used tobacco leaves for cleaning his teeth. I presume they're probably ground into
That's
some
expensive
sort of powder.
toothpaste based on
It
what
does.
I'm saying.
Yeah. So yeah, this would have been sort of 1780s or so. So perhaps it had come down in price by then, but
A bit cheaper then.
a bit cheaper. Good. So you can see that, and then also we know from all his account books that he was buying very exotic teas, sugars, Jamaican rum, lots of luxury products from Fortnum and Masons. So as you say, that the empire was sort of flowing into London as well, and people in Greenwich and elsewhere were really sort of taking advantage of that. So it's been fascinating to hear those links between our stories as well.
So we've got this very powerful, very rich, influential man, but his daughter, she's in the middle of all of this. She has access to equipment. And what sort of education did she get? She was sort of brought up in the tradition of the astronomy, wasn't she?
Exactly. So she had a very well-rounded education, like a sort of genteel young lady of her time. So in addition to reading, writing, and arithmetic, she had French, Italian, drawing, and also watercolor painting. And it's thought that she probably would have most likely have learnt some astronomy from her father as well. And in particular, we have this amazing object, I hope we can see it shortly, that really shows sort of a snapshot of some of those astronomical ideas. So here we are. This is what we call an orrery. It's a mechanical model of the solar system. And they're generally called orreries after Charles Boyle, the 4th Earl of Orrery, who commissioned these type of devices in 1713. And what's great is that we can use a bit of detective work from the planets to try and work out when this was made. So we've got our sequence of planets: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, but we've also got Uranus as well. So that means that it was made after 1781, when the planet was discovered by William Herschel down in Bath using a telescope. And then a few years later, in 1787, Herschel then discovered 2 moons around Uranus. So as we can see, Uranus has actually got quite a few moons around it. So that pushes it back even further to sort of 1790s or so. So we can really do a little bit of work. We can look at the name of the maker as well. We know that Jones was active until about 1830. So we know that this device was made sometime between the 1790s and 1830.
And what was the women have, almost always been hidden in history, but especially in the technical science, science at that time was very much here with the great men of science. And there were women behind the scenes. What was the attitude to her learning science and having these very technical toys? Do we know how?
Yeah, certainly. It's interesting. So as her father became increasingly frail in his later years, sort of before 1810 or so, we start to see Margaret sort of taking over his paperwork and his correspondence. So she was talking to astronomers at other observatories in Paris and Italy and elsewhere. So really sort of taking on that role as his intellectual heir, if you like. And no doubt there were probably many guests at the observatory as well. She would have met both the Herschels, but other astronomers and mathematicians, scholars from Cambridge and so on. So very much a hub of knowledge, and she was part of that, definitely.
And of course the Herschels, William and Caroline Herschel. So Caroline was a noted astronomer in her own right as well. So she would have had some female role models around on the technical side.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting that Margaret's father, Neville, actually refers to Caroline as his sister in astronomy. So he really regards her as an equal and someone worthy of attention, definitely.
Fabulous. Well, so if you've just joined us, this is Ship C and the Stars from Royal Museums Greenwich. And this week we're talking about hidden Greenwich with fabulous contributors Louise Devoy, Steve Martin and Lara Maitland. And we are going to start the next segment with a contribution from Steve. Now you're going to tell us about a person, but we're actually going to start with a picture of him. And this is Olaudah Equiano. I probably said that wrong.
Olaudah Equiano.
Tell us just a little bit about him before we get to some of the words he wrote.
Briefly, if possible, Equiano was the foremost or the highest profile Black writer in 18th century London. He was the face of the Black abolition movement. And he gave us the first account of being transported as an enslaved person across the Atlantic. And if you'd like me to mention the image we're looking at here, this is the frontispiece of the first edition of his narrative. And what's amazing about this is published in 1789, made a huge impact, was a real spur for the anti-slavery movement, the abolition movement. And in the image, what you see is this perfectly rendered composition of, in every single way, a man of letters, a man with lovely fine linen, this wonderful riding coat, and there he is holding in his right hand a Bible or a New Testament open to the book of Acts. And he's looking at this very composed, measured manner in every way, basically reflecting the potential either subscriber or buyer of this work, but in sepia, even down to his hair. If you'll notice, there's always something about hair. Even down to the hair, you'll notice it's actually shaped in the fashion of the European wearing a wig. So
it's almost funny in a way, isn't it? Because the Europeans were presumably wearing a wig to look like something else, and he didn't need a wig.
No, he did not. But what's really interesting is that he still fashioned his hair in that way, by way of selling himself and creating that sort of bridge of familiarity and similarity.
So although he was a respectable figure, his relationship with the world of Greenwich was not always smooth and friendly. And I think you've got a reading for us, an encounter he had on Greenwich Hill.
Okay, this is actually in Greenwich Park, and he's just come back from several years away. He's meeting back up with the Guerin sisters who live in Maze Hill, and there's a bit of a conflict because their cousin, Mr. Pascal, was formerly his master. Long story short, he's got a lot of money, £37. And he says, my first thoughts were to look out for some of my former friends. And amongst the first of those were the Miss Guerins. They lived at number 111 Maze Hill. As soon as I regaled myself, I went in quest of those kind ladies whom I was very impatient to see. And I found them at Maze Hill. They were agreeably surprised to see me, and I was quite overjoyed at meeting them. I told them my history, at which they expressed great wonder and freely acknowledged that it did their cousin, Captain Pascal, no honor. Basically, Pascal was the man who sold him in 1759, horrible circumstances in Deptford. And, but Pascal, being a cousin, goes there frequently, and Equiano bumps into him in Greenwich Park. I met him 3 or 4 days after in Greenwich Park. When he saw me, he appeared a good deal surprised and asked me how I came back. In a ship, I answered. In a ship, to which he replied dryly, I suppose you did not walk back to London on the water. So there's a little back and forth between them, but after that little argument, Equiano proceeds to try and press his case to establish that he has a right to earnings, which his former master had stolen from him. And he's still a young man at this stage, although he started being a sailor, having lots of adventures, absurd adventures around the world in the Royal Navy and on merchant vessels. But he's already got the confidence to demand of his former master, who is a man of parts and learning, some recompense for his labor, which he doesn't get. But the fact that he actually puts it forward with some force is really a sign of how he'll develop later as a writer and as an abolitionist.
And just tell us a little bit about the book, because the picture you showed us is from the front of the book, and that book was really significant, wasn't it?
Extremely significant, because it was the first person testimony, the first account of enslavement from an African perspective. He describes what it's like to be captured, what it's like to go endure the Middle Passage, what it's like to become a product, and how he worked his way out of it. He became a correspondent with a number of periodicals in Britain, and he became a leader, for want of a much better expression, or at least the most prominent face and voice of the needs of African people in Britain and abroad. And
what was, so he became respectable. Is that the picture here, that frontispiece is painting the picture that
that's it.
Made himself become acceptable, and then he had a voice.
Yes, and his whole path of respectability is just extraordinary. It's not just how he presents himself and his use of vocabulary and facility with it. It's his adoption and harnessing of Christianity. He throws himself into revealed religion in a most, to our mind, absurd way. But it's very impactful. He can say, though my skin is black, my heart is white, having been washed in the blood of Christ, etc., etc. And this is very impactful because it hooks up with other religious interest groups which are beginning to take the same view in regard of human value and worth.
And then this is very, very important in the abolitionist movement, that this voice becomes a tool. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, because he was one of many black men, many of whom had been to sea as well, and having been to sea become politicized, and they are hooked up to the abolition movement through Equiano, people like Cugoano, in a lesser degree, people like Ignatius Sancho, who also was a younger man, lived at the top of Greenwich Park. And they are presenting a voice and a face going all around the country, not just writing and printing, but also evangelizing quite literally across the British Isles, Ireland, of course, at the time, of course. And they are a genuine spur. Thomas Digges, the Belfast abolitionist, stated that had it not been for the exertions of Equiano and other black abolitionists, the movement wouldn't have become the first popular political movement or mass political movement in these islands' history. So it's no mean feat what he had performed.
And it sounds as though the ports were places where, that sort of made this possible, because you've got that mixing, you get people that can then have a voice, that places like Greenwich are really important to that story.
Yes, I mean, the conversations that must have been happening there on every level, because remember as well, in your opening reading, we do have the great and the good who had lacquered their presence into the current time on the living memory and history of Greenwich. But as well, you had ordinary people who were working, who were living, probably fighting as well, side by side and together, who were having a whole different set of dialogues. And both of these strains informed abolition and informed all sorts of things, including race relations, which we overlooked nowadays. It's as if we've just invented all of these attitudes and positions. But it's very old stuff we're talking about here.
So let's then move back up the hill to the scientists who were measuring while all of this was going on. They were in their ivory tower, and it is very like an ivory tower. I love the observatory, but it is that colour. So Louise, tell us a little bit about Annie Maunder, because she's one of the characters that when I first heard about her, what I think about as a physicist is we are taught about the Maunder minimum. No one ever tells you where the names come from, and that was Annie played a part in that story. So tell us about Annie, first of all.
Yeah, I mean, Annie's story is just full of so many battles and struggles. It's really quite inspiring. So she was born in Northern Ireland in 1868, and she studied mathematics at Cambridge. But at that time, women could take the studies, take the exam, but they weren't granted a degree. So she left and took up a post teaching, I think, a maths school in Jersey. And then in 1891, the Astronomer Royal, William Christie, decided to take on some women known as lady computers. And the idea was that you could take on these women graduates effectively, and they could do some number crunching and data processing, but at a very much reduced rate compared to some of the other people working in the observatory.
Which is interesting, because it kind of parallels what happened with early computing quite a few decades later, that the women did the basic computing work so the men could get on with the great thoughts.
Sure. When you think of films like Hidden Figures and so on, you can see those 20th century parallels, definitely. So Annie was 4 women who were taken on. And unlike some of the other observatories where the women literally just did the computing, the ladies at Greenwich were allowed to do some observing as well. They were actually trained on how to use some of the telescopes. And I think one of them actually scored sort of top marks. She was better than the men at the observing, because it was thought that women were more patient. But Annie was assigned to the solar department. So she was taking daily photographs of the sun using telescopes that had originally been designed for the transit Venus in 1874. So some sort of recycling of old instruments. And the idea was that by taking a daily photograph, you can see how sunspots, these little dark patches on the sun, vary over time. And then later on, in 1904, Annie and the man she married, Walter Maunder, then created this diagram showing how the initial appearance of sunspots varies over an 11-year cycle. And you get this very distinctive butterfly pattern that's now become known as the butterfly diagram. So a huge amount of meticulous work that we're still using today, effectively.
And did those four, were there then other women that followed on from them, or was that little group of four, were they the exceptions, and the observatory had ticked its gender balance box for a bit and carried on? Was there a tradition that carried on, or were they an exception?
In fits and starts. So yes, that group of four women, they were the only group at the time, and I think several of them moved on afterwards. They only stayed for about 2 years or so. Then during the First World War, Annie actually came back to the observatory as a volunteer because many of the male astronomers were called up for active service. And then in the 1920s and 30s, you start to see more women working at the observatory. They might be listed as clerical staff, but some of them we know were actually involved in measuring star plates from all the astrophotography. So it was a way of balancing job title and what you could get from the civil service in terms of pay and so on. So yeah.
Did they tend to come were they high status to start with, like Neville Maskelyne's daughter, or did they sort of work their way up through the ranks? Was there a way to almost go across a class boundary there, or did they come in as educated middle class or upper class women who had an opportunity that others didn't?
As far as I'm aware, they were mainly sort of educated middle class women who'd had the opportunity to learn and could come in. Certainly in previous centuries, there is a tradition of bringing local boys who show an aptitude for mathematics to come in, work as assistants for several months, and then go on into better jobs in, say, clerical work or teaching, but less so by the late 19th century, early 20th century.
Fabulous. Well, let's move on to, let's come back to Lara and the playthings that exist on the Thames foreshore, because along with all the symbols of empire and signatures of the great and the mighty, there are some fun things in there. So Lara, you have this fabulous whistle to show us. Do tell us about that.
I do. Well, I mean, one of the reasons I love mudlarking is because it's a connection with the past, and it's a connection with the forgotten, and it's the forgotten people of London. Some of the ordinary people who have left nothing other than perhaps a broken object or a lost button, or maybe a love token where they've scratched their name into it. And some of the things that I really love finding are children's toys, because they're so evocative. And you find these little broken toys and you just imagine the tears and the tantrums when they were lost. And this is one of the oldest toys that I found. I don't know if you can see it here. I'll hold it a little closer. Yes. It's made of clay. You can see it's got quite a lovely little face. And it's a really sort of almost a mystical creature. They've got one in the Museum of London and it's complete. So I know what it would have looked like. It's a whistle. It would have had these great big long rabbit-like ears and a hooded figure sitting on top, holding on to these big long ears. And out of its bottom would have come the mouthpiece for the whistle. So you would have blown into it, whoever owned it would have blown into it. And I don't know if it was thrown away when it got broken or whether it was lost and it got bashed up in the river. But I found this at Greenwich. It dates to around the 14th century. And it came all the way from Belgium. They were made in Belgium and brought over. There's one also in a museum in Belgium. And it's objects like this, for me, that are hidden London. All the objects that are hidden in the mud, still waiting to be found. So many of them still waiting to be found, and all those lives that they touched before they were lost or thrown away.
I'm fascinated by the idea of it not being completely unique, because if there's one in Belgium and one in the Museum of London, we're used to, I don't know, brands, for want of a better, My Little Pony they're all identical. They're made in vast numbers. And I had assumed that as far back as the 14th century that toy makers were perhaps, perhaps there was a type of thing that was quite common, but that there was more individual, I'm surprised that the same sort, because it's quite distinctive, this creature.
It's very distinctive. I suppose each potter would have had something that they were good at making, and if they could bash them out pretty quickly, They wouldn't have sold these for very much. They would have been sort of probably penny toys, you know. So they had to knock out quite a few of them to make a living. So if you made the same thing over and over again, you could get pretty quick at doing it. So I would imagine that was probably one reason why. I also find pewter toys from the 17th century. And they've obviously been made in molds, but they're beautiful little tiny miniatures of what the adults would have been using, pots. And I've got a dripping tray that would have gone under maybe a pig on the spit. They had grown-up ones of those that collected the fat, and this is a little tiny one. Fake little toy watches, and it's a bit of a myth that children back then didn't have a childhood. People you almost think of children as they just didn't have a childhood. They had to work, they had to get on with their lives, but they did have a childhood, and they had toys, very basic toys. I've got a little pig tassel that's been drilled, it's got 2 holes in it to turn it into a whizzer. And people made their own toys as well, and clay marbles, that's another one that you find quite a lot of. So, you know, children were playing, and they were probably playing by the river as well. It's a great place to play. Who wouldn't have gone down to the river for a bit of fun, and losing their toys at the same time.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the picture of the ports, I mean, ports and docks in general are that they're busy, they're kind of very functional, they're probably quite dangerous for small children, but also it's where you go, it's where things were happening. If you're a child, you always want to go to the forbidden place. So the picture in my head is, I'm sure it was a place where at least you knew where your children were, but you know, that question of the lure for a child of the exciting place, but also possibly the place where they weren't supposed to be because it was dangerous and functional and there were big barrels of stuff being carried around. I didn't. Do you see those histories in the same place on the Thames?
Well, quite possibly. I mean, it would have been a really exciting place with all these ships coming from all over the world and people from all over the world as well, and mingling, you know, a place where, you know, things were happening, incredible smells in the air, you know, the spices and the things that were going on, the noises and the languages. There were also communities. They lived right by the river. So their children would have grown up literally on the river, you know, the lightermen and the people who worked on the river and the fishermen, their children would have grown up right beside the river. And also, of course, there were the original mudlarks, and the original mudlarks tended to be children. There were children and old people, and people who could really, the only way they could earn a living was to scavenge on the foreshore. And they weren't looking for the sort of things I look for. They were looking for wood and coal and rope and maybe some bones they could sell to the glue makers, anything they could sell to survive, to get them a night in the workhouse. They really were just a step away from absolute destitution, and it was often children. There's a great bit that I read about the children that would gather in front of the Trafalgar pub. I don't know if you know the Trafalgar pub, right on the river, and they would wade around in the mud, and they would do tricks for the toffs that were standing in the windows, and they'd maybe flick them a penny, and if they did a back somersault into the mud, they'd flick them an extra penny. And so these children were risking their lives for a few pennies, wading around in the mud. But that was their life. So really the river was a place for children, but it wasn't a nice place for children. You know, around that time, the river was just a moving cesspit. It was not a nice place to go. The children didn't have shoes. They were wading around in the mud, cutting their feet on nails. So there were the children of the people who lived and worked on the river, and there were the mudlarks as well, who were eking a living out on the foreshore.
So we are almost out of time, which is always a great shame. But just before we finish, I'd like to ask each of you, so let's imagine ourselves on the shores of Greenwich in perhaps the 17 or 1800s. I'd like each of you to tell me about a person, let's populate, just very briefly, let's populate that foreshore in front of the old Naval College. So let's put just one person each, because clearly there are loads. Louise, let's start with you. Who's the person you're going to place on our foreshore?
Oh, I think possibly one of the assistants at the observatory, because they only got one day off a week on a Sunday, and maybe they need to get away from the hill and the observatory and all of that and just do something completely different. So maybe one of the assistants. Yeah.
Steve, how about you?
Oh, it'd probably predictably be one of the Greenwich pensioners, one of the Trafalgar veterans, either the African-American Richard Baker or John Simmons from Jamaica. Yeah, some we have an actual physical image of. I just waste my time doing this anyway, just imagining them in situ, living their lives.
And Lara, who are you going to put on our foreshore?
Mine's going to be a housemaid from the kitchens, from the great big Tudor kitchens of the old palace. And I want to meet her actually dumping a basket full of waste that I am destined to go through 500 years later.
That is brilliant. Fabulous image. Okay, we have run out of time. We will be back next week with more museum objects and more stories. Do remember that if you want to get in touch with us, search for Royal Museums Greenwich on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter. Now, not next week, but the week after, it is World Oceans Day. And so in 2 weeks' time, our episode will be a World Oceans Day special, a panel all about the ocean. And also there is loads of stuff happening on the museum for World Oceans Day. So it's still a few days off, but keep an eye out for that at rmg.co.uk/World Oceans Day. Next week, we are going to be talking about mermaids and mer people, because they have mythological origins, but they come up in lots of places and they've been reinterpreted in lots of ways, and we will be talking about that. And so it only remains for me to thank our fabulous contributors, Louise DeVoy, Steve Martin and Laura Maitland. Thank you to Simon Kane for the reading, to Steve Thompson for the music, James Gill was the producer. I'm Helen Chersky, and I'll see you next week.